Well, thank you very much, Jeff, and actually came to Washington via Riyadh rather than going to Melbourne via Riyadh. But it's great to be back. I do recall being here exactly a year ago, and I think I was watching my clock constantly because the 737 MAX disaster had just reared its ugly head. I had a flight to get home out of LA, and the routing that I took to get there was rather circuitous, to say the least. Good news this year is I'm here all day and I'm looking forward to it. And thanks to all of you for coming along. This is going to be a conversation, not an interview, but I am going to start off asking a couple of questions around here. And Andrew, one of the things that struck me and actually disappointed me, just for a little bit of clarity to start with, was that the rough patch for CCS was 2012 to 2018, perfectly aligning with my tenure as CEO of the Institute. I'd like to think I was sowing seeds rather than blowing things up, but we do see that we're coming out the other side. What I really wanted to start with, Andrew, was something I think you touched on, but it frames importantly everything. And our good friend Nick Stern from the London School of Economics is really quite fascinating at the moment in the way that Nick frames the challenge in front of us. And it's, for him, all about net zero emissions. And Nick tells the story from there around how this actually drives everything in the world ahead. I wonder if we can just get your take on NZE, and I know we've got the IPCC report, but you know, you go to lots of really significant meetings around the world. I'm interested in how you see that progression, and particularly what are the features we need to see from whether it's governments or the private sector or the ambition loop that you speak of. What are the critical things we need to see to bring that to life?
Well, there has, by the way, thank you. You told me that I was sort of interesting, but Jason was useful. So well done, Jason. It was a great presentation, by the way, so well done. So there has been a remarkable change just in the last 18 months. People were sort of like 2 degrees, 1.5 degrees. It's hard to get your head around all probabilities and so on. Net zero, people can understand. So basically, you know, if you take a piece of paper, fold it in half, and the size of the piece of paper is emissions today, fold it in half, that's where we need to be in 2030. Fold it in half again, that's where we need to be in 2040. Fold it in half again, and that's where we need to be in 2050. You get your head around that. So mathematicians here will figure out that was 87.5%, so that's 12.5% left. And that's where, if you like, the net comes in, the net zero, which is taking carbon out of the air. And I mean, it's so great to see the sky scenario putting nature-based solutions so prominent. And I hope it's not giving secrets away. You're planning to come up with a new sky scenario, which is very exciting. I was with Ben Van Beurden in Davos, and he was saying, you know, we've got a new sky scenario that's going to get to 1.5 degrees. And I said, oh, that's like Sky 2.0. He said, no, it's Sky 1.5. Very clever. And so people can get their head around net zero. And so what you're now having is a huge number of countries and companies that are committed to net zero. There are now 220 major international companies that have said, we're going to get to net zero by 2050. And we now have something like 75 countries that have said we're going to get to net zero by 2050. So take, say, the European Union, or take, say, Britain at the moment. Both of them are committed to net zero by 2050. They haven't yet said how they're going to ramp up their ambition to 2030. That's the job of the next few months leading up to Glasgow. But having that sort of goal is extremely helpful, because it's something politically we can really get our heads around. Now, I've got to be honest, most of those 220 companies, when they say we're going to get to net zero, don't necessarily know exactly what it means and how they're going to get there. That in and of itself is not a problem, as long as they get on with it pretty quickly. So, you know, Maersk biggest container shipping company, I guess, outside of China, who said, we're going to go to absolute zero in emissions. They don't know how they're going to get there, but they're working very hard on it. I think that's fine. So having that North Star is very important.
Thank you. And Andrew, I think we're going to come back to net zero a bit, so I've got a bit more to go on there. Jason, I found the numbers around Quest fascinating. And since you're the doer and he's the thinker, apparently, at sub 50 US a tonne, and I know that you can't necessarily just transplant the Canadian experience straight into the United States, but given that we are progressing reasonably quickly now, I hope, with the IRS guidance around 45Q, is that going to be enough to start a whole slew of new opportunity examinations of the Quest style in the United States? I mean, how big is 45Q potentially as a constructor, as an investor?
I mean, 45Q is a huge start for the industry in the US to really kick off. Everything up till now is mainly demonstration projects. And, you know, I would encourage everyone who has an interest in the US piece of this puzzle to read the National Petroleum Council report. I think there'll be some conversation. Cindy here will talk about it later today. And the NPC report, which many of us here in the room participate in, is a really good piece because it says absolutely 35 a ton for EOR, 50 a ton for permanent sequestration will underpin a sizable amount of new CCS projects in the US, and it will work. But it's only going to be projects where you have very high purity CO2 in close proximity to a suitable reservoir or a suitable EOR project. And that will get you an amount of CCS projects, but it's not getting us to 10,000. And that's going to require, as laid out in the NPC study, further financial support in the form of carbon price or additional tax credits. And it's going to require more looking at land and pore space and federal lands and offshore waters to understand where's the geology, how can we deal with all the mineral interests and everything else to make it work. But absolutely, we expect it'll kick things off, subject to the IRS issuing all the guidance and EPA issuing permits in less than 6 years, and all the other little challenges that do need to get worked out.
Now, the Sky scenario is fascinating, and the 10 gigatons for CCS being roughly translated to 10,000 facilities sounds a big number. But what we haven't talked about is the distribution of those 10,000 facilities around the world. And Andrew, I think you'll know very well, just as I particularly know very well, especially because of the part of the world I live in for at least some of the year. Developing nations are actually where a huge growth in emissions continues. And particularly in the Southeast Asian region, we continue to see an accelerating amount of unabated coal-fired generation being constructed. And in fact, under the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, that is quite a feature as they start to roll out the potential for investment in third countries beyond Southeast Asia. I'm interested in your thoughts, and perhaps this is a discussion we collectively ought to have, is how do we particularly crack this nut in developing nations around trying to get them to net zero emissions and allowing them to develop their energy systems just as we have, and get where the bulk of the remaining poverty-stricken population in the world lives. How do we balance these things off? We're not talking about OECD countries now, we're talking about more challenged ones.
Well, first, coal makes sense almost nowhere. If you take local pollution effects, that is, 7 million people died last year of air pollution. So coal is yesterday's fuel. So I don't see CCS having a useful role, particularly on coal. Rather, we should just look at the numbers. Take, say, Indonesia, for example. The Minister of Finance, Sri Mulyani Indrawati, who's a fantastic Minister of Finance. A year ago, she said to us, look, you keep saying that the renewables and even gas are much cheaper than coal, but actually I'm told that coal is much cheaper, and that's what my Minister of Energy is saying, and that's what the coal producers. And we looked at it, and it turned out that actually she was paying way too much for renewables, actually, for wind. Why? Because the financial system is just not very mature, and the financial system wasn't willing to take that upfront risk. There were various legal issues as well. So we compared, the same weather in other countries, what they're paying, with what she was paying. And when she saw that, she said, now I start to get it. And then on top of that, if you add the local pollution, it makes no sense at all for Indonesia to be building coal. So it seems to me that's one battle to fight. But you're asking a different one, which is, suppose they move to gas and other forms of fossil fuel. Is there something that can be done with regard to CCS? And one of the things I like the best about your report is this notion of sort of moving towards hubs, you call them, or is that what you call them? Sort of, if you like, very similar to the Norway thing, where instead of each plant having its own, reservoir, if you like, you commercialize that. I mean, that's really cool. Where you bring your carbon either through a pipeline or through shipping or what have you. I find that very exciting. We have to do the math, but I mean, the story of $50 a ton is really remarkable. I see Julio Feldman over there. I'm really looking forward to your talk, because I know you've got very strong views on this, and you're deeply informed. So it does seem to me that you are heading in a very exciting direction at the moment.
And if I could just add, I think the power is maybe not the most obvious place for CCS. Power, renewables are a really good answer in a lot of parts of the world. Natural gas, if it's displacing coal, is a great answer in a lot of the world. You can put CCS on natural gas. It is pretty expensive. But there are these hard-to-abate sectors. There are steel, cement, and fertilizers and ethanol production, and all these areas where we have CO2 that is not easily displaced with electrons. And that's where I think CCS has a massive role to play.
Exactly right.
And I think that's exactly what our status report's been showing for some time. But I'm going to challenge you a bit, Andrew, because Fatty Barol at the IEA quotes, not consistently interesting, because I think the numbers might be moving around, but the average age of the coal-fired power fleet in Southeast Asia is somewhere between 12 and 14 years. And the reality would be, if we were to go down the path of seriously addressing the emissions from those, is a premature stranding of those assets. Something that I think many of those countries are going to struggle to actually confront. And so as I think through that and talk to many of the countries and developers and so on, and China comes to mind, they're continuing to build unabated coal-fired power plants. They're also investing hugely in renewables and others. But I'm starting to wonder, actually, if rather than saying to those countries, you have to deal with your point source emission there, I'm beginning to wonder if somehow we've got to start finding an opportunity to put direct air capture someplace else in the world that actually deals and helps these countries deal with their emissions from their existing fleets, whilst undoubtedly we need to talk to them about what they invest in into the future. And so, Jason, I'm sort of interested as a fuel producer, but equally into the future. How big do you see this potential market? And this is not me asking Shell their revenue projections here, but how much do you think the industry is starting to think about storage as a business? Because I can start to see that there's lots of opportunities around the world, particularly in developing nations who aren't going to have those geoengineering skills necessarily, but would happily, well, perhaps not happily, but will need to pay somebody else to deal with it. Is this an industry of the future?
I think it is, but it does require some global carbon pricing or a lot of nation-state carbon pricing to make it work. And it requires Article 6 to work so that you can take carbon from one country and sequester it somewhere else. So there's some challenges there. But absolutely, this is, the Northern Lights Project is looking at how does Norway and our partners take advantage of favorable geology and an expertise and a knowledge base that other countries might not have. We are involved with a lot of the OGCI Kickstarter hubs, both here in the U.S. and abroad. They're looking at how can we identify places where there's good geology, good legal framework, where we can build these T-side kind of projects and create industrial hubs. And in the future, someone's going to be very successful building those hubs. And if you can get those hubs built before there's a big carbon price, and then all of a sudden you've got the hub and the carbon price goes up, you're going to do pretty well, I think.
So, I got to say, Andrew, I'm interested in just pursuing this developing nation stuff a bit further, because when I look across the challenges that we have globally at the UNFCCC meetings that both of us attend each year and see progress, but it can be a depressing place sometimes. I still worry that actually our biggest challenge is how to help those developing nations deal with their emissions and grow. And I'm really fascinated to try to think through how we mobilise things, because we've not seen great success from the Green Climate Fund, so far at least. We've not seen great success in developed nations really providing IP, providing all of the wherewithal to help those developing nations. What do we need to actually get action on that? Because I think, and perhaps you'll disagree with this proposition, I actually think if we don't get developing nations moving really soon, we are going to find that this isn't a 3 or a 4 degree world, it could be a 5 degree world. And that might be good for CCS in theory, but it is sure as heck not good for where we're headed to. So how do we crack that nut?
Well, the good news is that there's a new economic narrative out there that is catching hold. China now is getting it, although there's huge internal debate. So take 10 years ago even the good guys would say, look, we'd love to act on climate change, but actually it's going to hurt us in terms of jobs, in terms of growth, and so on. And even the way that, say, the Stern report, which is the ultimate, was the original economic report. The Stern report, which was written 16 years ago, or 15 years ago, basically took an approach that said there's costs today and there's benefits a long time in the future, and then you have to discount the benefits back to the present. So it very much depends on discount rates, cost benefit. If you ask Nick Stern, how would you write the report differently today? He said, I'd write it totally and utterly differently. We've learned so much, and technology's come down so much, that actually we now know that smart policies, and they have to be smart, market-based policies on climate change will lead to more economic efficiency, because you'll use energy more smartly and resources more smartly. It will drive technology, and we're learning a lot about induced technological change. It will stop bad things happening, which is good, which is what the whole point is. And because the risk of bad things happening is less, risk will be reduced, which is extremely important. Risk is very high today because nobody knows. You just have to look at that chart. That's what they're worried about. The risk is high. Lower the risk and you get more investment. So in other words, you talk to the Chinese now, and they will, if they're honest, they will say there's a huge debate going on at the moment within the Chinese government. You've got some who totally now internalize that. There are others that are saying, wait a minute, our growth rate has just fallen, we're in trouble, so we have to go back to the true and tried approach, which is more coal and so on. And that debate is alive and well. I think there are people in this room that have done some of the analysis that we've also done, which, say, with Tsinghua University, we were able to demonstrate that it was in China's interest to peak its emissions by 2030, which is what its commitment was in 2015. The analysis now shows that actually it's in China's interest, nothing to do with the global, but just in its own national economic interest to peak by 2025. So in other words, but that battle still has to be won, and it has to be market-based, as Jason was saying. And I mean, how cool it was. We now have a coalition in this country where CEOs of major corporations, including Shell, including BP, to go together with Gretchen Watkins, the two of us went to see some senators to talk about pricing carbon. And the senators sort of said, they looked at me and they said, well, obviously this guy, this environmental organization, of course he wants to price carbon, but why would Shell be wanting to price carbon? Sounds like you want us to tax you. And it was so cool to hear the argument from Shell, from Gretchen. who basically said, look, quite frankly, with a $50 a ton carbon price, we're able to actually then invest in something which will keep us going, which is CCS. Otherwise, we can't do it. In other words, that's that same notion of sort of the new economics of the 21st century.
So, Jason, an interesting topic in Riyadh last week that came up repeatedly, actually, was not so much around CCS, but more about the esteem that the oil and gas industry is held in generally around the world. And as you can imagine, particularly in Saudi Arabia, there's a certain sensitivity to criticism, particularly a feeling that achievements and contributions are often overlooked, and some green groups, but not this guy's, of course, label the oil and gas industry simply the villains, and they should be forced to pay. When you were talking about before coalitions are necessary to get projects to work, it caused me to recall some of those discussions that were had quite openly in Riyadh last week. And I wonder how you feel the oil and gas industry is progressing down that pathway, because increasingly I see, especially the IOCs, making commitments to change and investments to change. Are you seeing that that's changing the narrative and the discussion between those who are critical? What more is needed, and how in this room can we actually support that building of coalitions that are more powerful than what we might have seen?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really challenging topic for us, and we kind of group external stakeholders in buckets, and there are some groups for whom we will always be the villain, and we're never going to convince them that we're a force for good, or that you can't go from the current energy system to one that has zero emissions, in the next 4 years, without crippling the economy. And for those people, it's unfortunate. It's really hard to have a dialogue with that group. There are the groups in the middle that will work with us and talk to us, and that's where we focus. That's why we work with Andrew and other NGOs that are willing to help us educate consumers. Because fundamentally, our proposition is 80% of the world's energy is supplied by fossil fuels today, and that energy is what sustains life as we know it. And we are committed to helping our customers and the societies we work in through a transition that is fair and just and gets to a net zero world. But we can't do it on our own. If all the IOCs in this room stop producing oil tomorrow, other than making a lot of Russians and Saudis very wealthy very quickly, it wouldn't actually change the dynamic of the system. And we're not apologetic if people are going to continue buying full-size trucks, which is all people buy here in the United States. If they pull up to a Shell station, we're going to sell them gasoline. Equally, if they want to get electric cars, we're going to help build out EV infrastructure and green power, but we can't move faster than society. So where we need these coalitions is to really educate society and policymakers. That was the reason you being up on the Hill with Gretchen is, policymakers don't everywhere always quite get it. And we need to help policymakers implement good policy and for consumers to make much more informed choices so that we can all move on this journey together.
Well, I go, as you would imagine, one step further than you. It's not just if people want gasoline, we'll sell it to you. It's that we're going to be part of the journey to have less gasoline. I mean, it's really fascinating if you look at oil and gas majors. I know we've got Gina here from Statoil and we've got some of the others, sort of the really Equinor. We love you, whatever your name. So it's really fascinating to watch, and even I won't name names, but 5 years ago, the story from oil and gas was actually, it's just not possible. We cannot figure a way to get to 2 degrees. It just isn't possible. Phase 2 was, it is possible, but actually we don't think it's going to happen. Phase 3 was, it is possible, we hope that governments will act, and if they do, we'll follow along. None of those are good enough. The 4th is, it is possible, and we're going to wake up every Monday morning, and we're going to work over the weekend as well, and we're going to make it happen. It will not happen without the fossil fuel industry wanting to make it happen in a really aggressive way. You don't get to the moon by saying, well, I hope the other guy figures out how to do it. And you don't. I mean, so I'm not saying this is not a criticism, but it's a very, very important point, which is you have to be part of the solution. And that's what's so exciting. And what is missing massively, I mean, in this debate, I mean, for heaven's sake, the future of the world is at stake here. And where are the big coalitions? I mean, where is the Trump administration? I mean, surely there is some big deal to be done with the 20 top, fossil fuel oil and gas companies together with the Trump administration, not putting in $1 billion here, $1 billion there, putting in tens of billions of dollars, driving down those costs and so on. And also there needs to be a deal, and I love the way you're thinking about this, because I know you are thinking about this. There needs to be some vertical deals. I mean, where are the deals between the automakers and the gasoline providers and the scientists? I mean, where is the kind of, Manhattan Project here? And until we get there, we aren't going to be there. And that's what you need to be involved in as well, Brad. You are, aren't you?
And maybe just touch on that. I mean, your moonshot analogy and your moonshot program that you've laid out in the paper was, I think, very solid. And I think the governments need to look at this. And it's absolutely right. We and others in this room are investing billions in renewable energies and nature-based solutions and CCS and all the other good things. But those billions aren't enough to achieve what you're talking about. I do think that bringing it back to CCS and kind of what are the moonshot ideas for CCS, the blue hydrogen economy is one that's quite viable. Here in the United States, you literally cannot give away natural gas in the Permian right now. And that natural gas, if you can do CCS on it, provides you a pathway to a clean hydrogen economy. But that requires consumers and users. But it's a huge opportunity for CCS and blue hydrogen to really unlock a whole new business model.
So I'm really glad you segued there, because that's where I was headed to next. And I was going to start with an observation, and the observation is that I can see in ever so many parts of the world a big focus on a hydrogen future, and some of us are old enough, aren't we, Andrew, that we remember the last time the hydrogen economy was talked about and it fizzled out, but it's back. And it's back big time in Japan and Korea as markets, and a very clear ambition from those two governments around hydrogen markets. It's clear in the UK and across Europe increasingly as hydrogen to decarbonise heating in particular. Even Australia released its national hydrogen strategy back in November last year, sees itself as a supplier and exporter, and it was a discussion for a whole day in Riyadh last week around hydrogen. And then I come to the United States, and I don't come as often as I'd like to, but I do come enough, and I almost don't see the discussion. And I just wonder what's missing here, given exactly what you've just said. Some of the cheapest gas you'll find anywhere in the world, fantastic CCS opportunities, and almost a complete blind spot around what's going on elsewhere. So tell me I'm wrong, tell me the commercial sector's got it, and Andrew, you guys are based here. What's your take on this and the opportunity for hydrogen?
So commercially, if you happen to be one of the few people in California that drive a Honda Toyota hydrogen fuel cell vehicle, you can fill up at a dozen or so Shell hydrogen filling stations on the West Coast. And I will tell you, they have to give those cars away because people are either going to stick with internal combustion or they just like a Tesla. And so that market hasn't really picked up in the light-duty passenger vehicle. We are doing pilots for heavy-duty vehicles, so trucks, where EV is really challenged and hydrogen looks very interesting, and we're working with partners there. There's a huge chicken and the egg challenge with hydrogen because you have to have a hydrogen provider to show up with hydrogen, you have to have an OEM to develop a hydrogen truck, and then you have to have a fleet owner to buy those trucks and operate them. So it's really hard to pilot. We're doing it, but it's small. I think the other reason you're not seeing it in the US as you are in Japan and Korea, fundamentally Japan and Korea are small, rocky, lacking a lot of sun and wind. So renewables are hard, and in the U.S. we have lots of sun and wind, and so it's not as urgent as a national priority to figure out the hydrogen economy as it is in other parts of the world.
Well, look, you won't go there unless there's some incentive to go there. This country currently provides almost no incentive to go there. We live in a country that actually doesn't really believe that these global problems require governments to play a big role. At the subnational level, we certainly do have that, but they're not big enough to make a difference. And so, if you go to Denmark, they believe that God actually gave us governments to play a useful role, not just defend themselves. And so, the government of Denmark just said, we're going to reduce carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions by 70% by 2030. All the officials in the private sector were gobsmacked. They said it's not possible, never heard of that. Well, that was just 6 months ago, and now they're remaking the whole of government. They've set up things that they've never done before, sort of public-private partnerships across 12 different sectors and so on. They are in the market for big ideas. We are not in the market for big ideas, apart from let's deregulate, let's get the government out of here, and so consequently we won't lead. And even in the areas where we are in big ideas, I mean, obviously we lead the world in IT and so on, we tend to say, oh, that's all the private sector. Well done, Google. We don't give any credit for actually the US government money that actually made Google possible. We downplay that. So we're at a very sad stage in history, and I know I'm on thin ice when I say that. The greatest country in the history of the world, without whom we will never solve any of these problems, is simply not in the market for big ideas, or not willing to, have the backbone to put the resources in that are required to form the coalitions. The UK government, by the way, let me not say I started life in the UK, but they made and are making lots of mistakes. But for example, in the lead up to Glasgow, they're going to pick a few things that they want to make a breakthrough on. One of them is electrification of automobiles. So if you look at Bloomberg New Energy Finance, it's by 2040 we will be maybe 40% of automobiles will be electric, or at least non-internal combustion. And they're saying, look, why don't we get together with the Europeans and maybe the Chinese and some others? Let's double it. Let's say 80% of vehicles. It'd be easy to do, actually. I mean, the United Kingdom and now 12 other countries are saying, we will not allow the sale of internal combustion engines after 2035 or something like that. Now, you might say that's not the business of government. Well, okay, but can society make decisions? Is there a way that society as a group can make decisions? And if we don't use governments to do that, what do we use? So, sorry, a bit of a rant, but it's such a shame, and that's why we rely on the private sector here so much. And all I would plea from you is that you lobby the government to be a partner in a much more genuine way. I mean, obviously 45Q was a great blessing. Should have happened a long time before, but there needs to be much more than that.
It's at this moment I'm pleased I'm not a US national, and I'll allow these other people to quiz you shortly or express their views. I've got a final question for both of you, and it starts with an anecdote. I was in China well before the coronavirus, fortunately, last year, and sitting in a conference next to a very senior official in China. I prefer not to name them given what I'm about to tell you they said. And the conversation was very much around looking forward to, at that stage, Madrid, and then subsequently Glasgow, and the outlook for negotiations as we came into what's really a critical period now. The observation was made to me that, well, the signs for the global economy are not looking as rosy as they were. And at least in China, the greatest risk to moving forward on climate negotiations is a depressing effect on our economy and the global economy, because very quickly leadership's attention will move only to jobs and economic health. Probably pretty right, we've seen that before. However, what we now experience and tragically, since that conversation, has been this outbreak of the coronavirus. I believe oil demand's down fairly substantially, prices depressed. I think Xi Jinping might be facing a very challenging moment when industry finally gets back to action and people who've been seeing blue sky for the past few weeks go back to enjoying choked atmospheres again. But what does this potentially mean for the negotiations in Glasgow, given that I do think we're not going to see a rebound in the global economy very quickly, and we probably certainly haven't seen the end of this virus yet. I'd start with you, Andrew, and then ask you, Jason, for your thoughts.
Well, it's not good. Any old-fashioned environmentalists who think that we need to slow down growth and that will help the environment, are wrong. We need healthy, vibrant growth if we're to make the progress, and we need a vibrant, healthy private sector making good profits if we are going to. And you're dead right about China. We and you work with them very closely, and I think they're very honest. Just like any country, there is a huge debate going on, and there is a view that there is they know how to grow the old-fashioned way, and yes, it's true that people die prematurely of air pollution, but they know how to do that. They're still, as you say, they're still investing twice as much in renewable energy as we are here, but coal having fallen for 3 years now, it's rising again, and that's not a good thing. So in terms of the negotiation for Glasgow, it's not a good thing. Even the preparatory meetings are being threatened. Yesterday, the World Bank and the IMF cancelled their spring meeting on the 15th of April. That was going to bring this group of finance ministers for the climate. We were planning some amazing meetings with these finance ministers to try and change the calculus. That's all gone now. So it's going to make it much more difficult. There still are some pretty good things out there. We still do have countries that are going to ramp up their level of ambition, and what we have to do is demonstrate that actually smart action on this will help boost the economic growth. If you those of us that did PhDs in economics, you take the sort of Econ 101 on growth theory. You want to grow, you have to generate new technology. That's the only source, together with population growth, over the long term that will drive your... We actually have not been doing very well on total factor productivity. We need a new boost of technology. That's what this would do. It's what you guys are talking about today. That will boost the economy. So too, if you want to have healthy growth, you need more resource efficiency. So that we can offer that. And so too, you need lower risk. Risk is too high. You are offering to reduce risk. So we need to, if you like, be all the more convincing on this new economic narrative.
Yeah, and I'll just I'll reference Andrew's earlier slides, and he quoted the Energy Transition Commission report where it said you could solve all the hard-to-abate sectors if you just had 0.5% of GDP for 10 years. That's because if you tell people it costs several $1 trillion, they choke. But if you say it only is 0.5% of global GDP for a decade, that doesn't sound so bad. But it's true, but 0.5% of global GDP per year in a growing economy is a lot easier than 0.5% of GDP in a declining economy. And so I think we will all be watching with bated breath China's response when they kind of come back online. And will China have its TARP program, its kind of massive reinvestment? Before all of this, I think China was taking a long-term view on we want to own battery tech, we want to own EV tech, we want to own solar panel tech, because those were those growth opportunities for them. Are they going to double down on that, or are they going to turn around? That's a big question.
So when I come back next year, Andrew, and I hope you'll join me, I'm hoping that those graphs are going to show that I've well and truly left behind the mud. I've never been into tough mudder, I can assure you, and that those green shoots are turning into crops. And until next year, we won't know the answer. But for the moment, we've run out of time, and I wonder if you'd all join me in thanking both Andrew and Jason.